Okay, so welcome to today's Geometric Sports Analytics Seminar at Queen's. As Nora said, this is part of the Sports Analytics Initiative at Queen's, which has a variety of different pieces, including that I have four wonderful undergraduate Queen's students who've been working with me on geometric sports modeling, particularly soccer and basketball. And so without further ado, I'll introduce, so this is, our speakers today, in the order I believe that they will be speaking, will be Dan Forestell, Emily Hunter, trying to remember the order, Maia Gibbon, and Sara Stephens. And please feel free to ask any questions or also to send them to me in chat and I'll ask them for you. Okay, so let's get started.
Sure, I'll get going. And let me know, do you see presenter view or the presentation?
It's perfect.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about one of the models we've been working on over the past few months, and that's the passable regions model. So just an overview of what I'm going to briefly talk about. The goal of this model is to construct a probabilistics and physics-based model to determine which regions on the field players could pass to and when these passes would be successful. We use this model kind of as a building block and as a way to get at some more insightful models that provide more valuable information. And this model specifically we use to kind of look at which regions on the field were safe areas, which ones players controlled, and where could the team control the ball if it was passed there. And we also want to look at individual player metrics. So trying to identify players that were best at creating passing options and creating areas that other players on their team could expose and attack. So we started off kind of at the start of all of this with a very basic dominance model built off of Voronoi tessellations. These tessellations are simply areas on the field in which a player can get to before everybody else on the field. So as you can see in this diagram on the right there, the blue team has certain regions and the red team has certain regions. We would call all of the areas that the red team has that team's region, and all the areas the blue team has would be the blue team's region. So we like this. It creates a very pretty picture, but we realized that there were still some limitations to it and things that we couldn't quite see from it. And the main thing is that it assumes that each player is stationary, which we know rarely happens in soccer. So to address this, we tried to build a model that would incorporate some kind of player velocity and determine where players and the ball were going to be, not just where they were currently standing. So to get a better picture of this, we tried to build a physics-based model to get a look at this control and dominance that the Voronoi kind of gave us a look at. And the way we did that was we found the time for each player and the ball to get to every single point on the field. And the way we assigned the areas and the dominant regions were to give it to a player or a team if their player got there before anybody else on the field. So it's the same idea as the Voronoi, except we're incorporating this velocity component and we're focusing on the team, not simply the player. So this is what our first implementation of that looked like. Here, we only have the blue team shown on the picture, or the region shown on the picture. The red team is shown with their velocities and as the black arrows. The blue team has their velocity shown as well, and that green dot in the middle there is the ball. So what this is showing, the blue areas are the areas on the field that blue can get to before every red player and before the ball. The gray areas in the middle and a little bit on the outside are the areas that the ball can get to first. So it's interesting to note that, for example, areas down to the left here or back to the right, the ball can get there before any player. So that's interesting to look at as we look at kind of through balls, lofted through balls. If the blue team were to play a ball into one of those areas, it would get there before the blue players would, and it could be a 50-50 battle or something like that. So those are interesting points to look at. And so we like this model. Again, it created a very nice picture for us. but we wanted to incorporate a little bit more. So we have these dominant regions and we have the areas in the field that certain players are going to get to first, but we want to incorporate a passing element as well. So we wanted to look at the success rate or the failure rate of passes. We wanted to kind of weight these areas and scale them based on whether or not a pass to that area would be successful. So as you can see, certain passes are very unlikely to be successful. For example, these two, they pass right through two red players. We know that if that were to happen in a game, it would likely get picked off or intercepted. So we wanted to basically make those two blue players, the receivers of the pass, their areas less prominent because the odds of the ball actually going there were quite slim. And at the same time, we wanted to make sure that successful passes, or passes that were likely to be successful, were more heavily weighted. So for example, these three passes to the defenders and out to the wing were far more likely to be successful. The reason for that being there's no red player nearby, and it's a pretty short pass, at least the two at the back. The one out to the wing is a little bit farther, but we'll talk about that. And so we wanted to create a model that could look at the success rate of these passes and how could we actually quantify whether or not that pass would be successful. So to do this, we created kind of a probability of interception, and we determined the area in which an interception was possible. The way we looked at that was we created this kind of triangle from the passing player to the receiving player, with that dotted arrow being the pass. These red dots here would be hypothetical opposing players. And basically said, if there's somebody in that triangle, there's a chance the pass will get off. If there's nobody in the triangle, it should be pretty likely that the pass is successful, other than human error on the part of the passer or the receiver. And that was accounted for slightly in our calculations. And basically what we did, we said if there were players in these triangles, we took the orthogonal distance to the passing lane and weighted it accordingly based on where they were in the triangle. So the reason we use the triangle is if there was a red player, say, close to the other player about here, they wouldn't be able to intercept that pass. Whereas this red player is about the same distance away from the passing lane, but it's at a later point in the pass, so they have time to react to the ball actually being played there. And so when we did that, we created this new implementation of our model, which accounted for these probabilities. The darker blue regions are the areas in which a pass will be successful and there's dominance in that region. And the lighter blue areas still have some sort of dominance, but passes are unlikely to go there. So for example, if we look at those two blue players where the pass is unlikely, their area has become much, much lighter, whereas these three have become much darker because it's highly likely that a pass there will be successful. The other interesting thing to note is this blue player up here. So they still have quite a dark region. And you might ask why, given that there's some red players in that passing lane. And the reason is that they don't really have any red players nearby them. And hypothetically, a lofted pass could get to them and the chance of success would still be pretty reasonable. And so next we want to kind of add a time component to these. So it's all great to look at those individual models or those individual pictures of the pitch at a given time, but we wanted to see how these evolved over time. So to do this, we created this 3D model. This is an example of one just using the Voronoi regions. And basically what this is, every cross section is the pitch at a given time t. So at the very bottom, we'll have t equals 0. And at t equals 1, we add another pitch where the players have slightly moved and our model is slightly changed. So we stack these on top of each other and create this 3D model. So I'm going to take a look at how that does for our model. Here is the very first kind of animation that I'm going to show, which is on the left, you will see the 3D model building up, again, with those cross sections being the field at any given time. And on the right, we have the actual 2D picture. So you can see kind of what's going on the right, and on the left, we'll see that model built up. So I'm gonna let that play through. And we see the red team plays it back, and they're moving up the field now. Okay, so I'll play that one more time and kind of talk through it as we do. So on the left, we see those regions building up over time. They seem to get very small as the ball moves back, but then as red starts to move up the field, we see that some regions appear upfield and others kind of evolve along the way. Their regions becoming much greater until eventually they lose the ball and you actually see their region shrink back. So this is a pretty good look at how successful or how likely it is that red will still be able to control the ball when there's lots of area. You would think that there's a fairly high chance that they still control the ball. Whereas if their area shrinks, that chance of them controlling the ball becomes a lot less likely. And so some questions that we wanted to address with this model was, can we identify the safe regions where players will likely receive a pass? We don't really want to look at the areas where it's unlikely for a pass to succeed because those areas might not be important to the game. So we also want to look at how can these areas be exploited? For example, if there's often a passable region right in front of the opposing team's goal, that would be an area that the attacking team would want to exploit. They would want to try to make passes there since clearly the other team isn't doing a great job defending there. So we wanted to look at how we can make the most of these areas. And another thing was individual player metrics. So which players often found themselves in passable regions. And we see a lot of the time that the goalkeeper does, which makes sense, but might not be the most interesting fact. We can often see passes back that become pretty likely. We want to more look at midfielders and attackers and how often they were getting themselves into these dangerous areas in these passable regions. And then finally, we wanted to kind of exploit the geometry as well and look at the patterns, see which patterns appear and see if we can associate those patterns with certain results later in the game. So for example, one thing we tried to look at was shots on goal and scoring chances, because as we know, there's not a lot of scoring in soccer. So oftentimes shots are the better indicator because they happen more often. So trying to associate these different patterns that we see in the passable regions to the shots on goal and other classical stats throughout the game. And so this was a good starting point for us. We had a very good preliminary model at showing where these safe passable regions might be. But we found that as we developed a little bit further, the 3D models can be at times hard to decipher for this specific model. And there might be better models that give us more valuable information. So we've kind of been looking at, is there a better way to quantify and visualize these potential passing lanes and passing channels, which Emily will speak a little bit about next. So thank you. I'll open it up for questions now, and if you don't want to ask now, feel free to email me afterwards.
So thank you, Dan. Yeah, so we can ask questions now. We can ask them at the end. You can send them to me in chat or to Dan.
I'll open with a question. For the model itself, if I remember correctly, does it use or take into consideration aerial passes? So passes via the air?
Not explicitly. It does take into account basically looking at how far the opposing players are away from the receiver. So that kind of implicitly incorporates the aerial pass, but that actual triangle passing lane doesn't. And
what complications do you think would arise if you tried to make it more explicit in the model?
It becomes complicated with the physics of it, because you add a whole new element there, but also certain players, there's also a fair amount of skill involved in that. So it's hard to model it across all of the players. So there are some further complications, which is why we kind of tried to keep this as simple as possible, just to get a preliminary look at these regions. We've tried to incorporate that aerial part, but it sometimes provides weird results, and we decided it was best to stick with ground passes for now.
Yeah, thanks. Understandable and good job.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Muse.
Yeah, thanks. This is fun stuff. I might have missed it, but does the velocity play a role in the triangulation analysis that you do? So the direction, it doesn't. So I mean, somebody running away from the orthogonal is very, very different to change their momentum than somebody running towards the passing lane, right? How would you incorporate this into the model?
So we haven't incorporated that at this point, but it's something we've been looking at because, as you said, running away from that passing lane will be a lot different. Kind of the assumption we're making here is that when an opposing player sees that pass, they'll obviously pivot and go to intercept it. But as you said, that changes depending on what their initial velocity is. So we've been looking at incorporating it, but haven't used that yet.
Right, and there's this sort of baseline assumption that everybody has clear sight, everybody knows instantly when the ball is kicked and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, in an actual game, if you're shielded by another player, then your opponent doesn't see the pass at all, right? And so the existence of other players, even if they're on your team, aren't, it sort of influences who can get into that passing lane. Are you thinking of extending this into sort of the multi-agent view of what might even be picked up by the opponent players?
A little bit, yeah. We've been looking at also passes that can be made in like two passes. So if we're passing from point A to point B, is there a way to go around that? It's a little bit more difficult to model those, as you said, multi-agent decisions or models. So something that we've been looking at, but again, hasn't quite been implemented yet.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
I should say that actually some of these things were things that, so we did look a little bit for a little while at, well, one thing we did realize was that athletes running tend to pivot unless they're completely turned the opposite direction. Instead of arcing, they actually tend to pivot. And so that doesn't really affect things that much. There is, and I don't know if you were here for Dr. Spearman's talks, we talked about the fact that a lot of these other things that, we notice them, but they don't actually create that much impact on, they're usually not worth coding in, basically in terms of the time that it takes to run, as well as how much impact they actually have on outcome. He was even in large scale, I think, saying they leave out to a fair extent, even the difference that a team who, so your own team better than the opponent. So you are going to be able to anticipate what your own team is going to do faster than the opponents can. And that does have an impact, but he was saying even that doesn't have as much of an impact as we might think. So some of this as we were going along, adjusting to things that we were hearing from analysts for different soccer teams that they were finding that it was safe to leave out.
Right, yeah, and it's only worth putting in the approximation if it's going to help in the end with the analysis, right?
Right.
If it's such a negligible,
running time is a big issue. But the aspect where we're getting into the fact that a team has many players on it is Emily's going to be addressing that. So this is how we actually went to the next model of trying to look at more of a multiplayer strategic kind of approach. So so that leads in well to, unless there are other questions, that leads in well to Emily. So this is Emily Hunter, also of Queen's University.
Yes, hi everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay? Okay, so today I will be talking about one of our newer models called the Voronoi channels model, or sometimes the passing channels model. A brief outline of what I will be discussing. So first I'm going to talk about the motivation and kind of background of our model and why we felt the need to really look into this. And then we had to make some assumptions and kind of decisions about our data before we continue. And that leads into the two-dimensional, and then most importantly, the three-dimensional model. And finally, I'll talk about some interesting points and preliminary results that we've already seen, as well as where we want to go in the future with this. If you have any questions at any time, please feel free to stop me. Yeah. So for this model, we kind of wanted something that would look at off-the-ball movement. A lot of models for soccer examine, whether making a pass was a good idea, or whether it increases scoring opportunities or expected goals. But there's still 21 other players on the field. So we wanted to look at whether people who didn't have the ball were making the right decisions. And a useful metric for this is obviously whether you're open. Can you receive the ball? And if you can, do you have something to do with it? Or are you just going to run at 5 defenders? So what we did was we defined these ideas called passing lanes, which kind of, as Dan described, is the line between 2 players where a pass could occur. And if you look at the region bounded by these passing lanes, that can give us a closed shape, and then we can put that into 3D. So for example, if we have 3 players here, and they can each pass to each other, that gives us a triangle. And then if we extrapolate that over time, then you might get something like a prism. But before we go into that, let's talk about the assumptions that we had to make for this. So for this model, we're only going to look at passes on the ground. Passes in the air are much less secure. It's hard to guarantee that it's a successful pass, especially when we're not looking at pro players all the time. We also decided to look at Voronoi tessellations to split up the field. This is kind of a baseline just to create our model, and now we're in the process of turning that into the passable regions that Dan described. We also have to kind of concretely define this idea of a passing lane. So for our purposes in this model, a passing lane is going to be a line between 2 players that doesn't cross into the other team's Voronoi region. And again, for our final model, we're also looking at the time to intercept for various players on the other team, just like what Daniel talked about. So let's give some examples of a passing lane. If this player has the ball down here, the only person that she can really pass to is the goalkeeper, because everyone else, like this pass, would go through the red team's region. In reality, you could potentially have a lofted ball into there, but it'd be very dangerous because there's just so many players surrounding that. So we defined that would not be a good pass to make, and the only pass that she could make is back here. On the other side of the field, you can see these 3 players, and they can all pass to each other, which gives us one of those cycles that I was talking about. We often found that there were more cycles actually away from the ball on the other side of the field than on the ball, which leads me to my last assumption, was that we're going to look at all the cycles on the field, not just those around the ball. So to implement this 2-dimensional model, we decided to apply graph theory, where every player on the field is going to be a vertex, and every passing lane is an edge of a graph. So you see in this picture, again, a Voronoi tessellation, and the ball is down here on its way to the goalkeeper. So all the players are a vertex on the field, and every pass is an edge. So for this model, we're only looking at one team at a time so far. So for the red team, they could make these 3 players connected, and these 3 players are also connected. And because they're all connected, it makes it red. However, these players are green. These passes are green because you could pass out to this person, but they don't really have any more passes to go from there. They would just have to dribble into this space or maybe make a long ball down the wing, but they aren't part of like a larger unit within the team. But in graph theory, not all cycles are equal. There's this idea of a complete cycle. So if we look over here, some of the complete cycles in graph theory are when every player can pass to every other player, or when every vertex is connected to every other vertex by a single edge. So in our models, we've usually found that these cycles contain 3, 4, sometimes 5 players. So we don't get things quite as complex as this. For example, here, these 4 players can all pass to each other. So they make a red cycle. This one over here is yellow because while there is still a cycle, we can trace that path there. These 2 players can't pass to each other. So it's not quite as connected as the red one is. And you'll also notice that sometimes these red cycles overlap the yellow ones. So there's definitely a red cycle here and a red one here. But that kind of works itself out in the 3D model, which I'll get into. But before that, I just want to make sure that makes sense. If you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, so onto the 3D model. From now on, we're going to first off ignore those green lines. Remember, those were like the one-off passing lanes that weren't really connected to anything else. We found that these weren't telling us very much, and they were just blocking our view of the other cycles. So similar to how Daniel was describing the creation of a 3D model, we're going to stack these cycles over time. So if we let each XY plane be a soccer field with the nets on the x-axis, and say the red team's going left to right, blue team right to left, then the z-axis is going to be time. And if you imagine one of those triangles that we saw on the previous slide, and you put it down on the field and you fill it, then we get a closed polygon. So that's at time 0. We have, say, 1 cycle on the field. If we look a half second later, we see that these players have moved a little bit, but they're still fully connected. So it looks like that. Then a half second later, it's like that, and then like that. And then maybe another player decides to join that cycle. So now there's 4 players, which gives us a rectangle. And that keeps moving on over time. And you can see that if we trace this kind of outline, we get something of a 3D shape. And that's really what we're interested in here. So here's a little animation. In the first frame, you can see on this side, here's that red cycle, and there's one down here, which get translated over here. And same thing for the yellow one. Now at the next instant in time, here, this red one has disappeared because that blue player kind of edged in. So now there's just these 2 cycles which get stacked onto there. And then at the next instant in time, a yellow one has appeared, and this yellow one has overlapped the red. So that's why it kind of becomes orange, which is what I meant when I said that the overlapping kind of sorts itself out in 3D. So the more red it is, the more complete it is. Essentially, like it's on a scale from yellow to orange. So I'm going to let this animation play through once, and then we can kind of talk about it a little more. Okay, so the most interesting thing from this one is what happens right around here. At this point, the red team just has 1 cycle, and it's kind of on the left side down here. And then as they play the ball, they start to gain more and more space. They have more and more dominance on the field. And we are very interested in learning how they do that, how these cycles are created, and whether they are dangerous or not, like whether they actually have an influence on the team's scoring opportunities. Let's look at another example here. This one, there's a lot more happening at the very beginning. So the red team is defending right now, and they're about to win the ball and then play it up the right wing. And they actually end up with a shot slightly off target. Okay, so there's a lot more happening in that one. So I'm going to let it play again. Red team wins the ball and plays it out to the right side. Some runs from forwards, and the people on the left are trying to connect in there. And shot on net, shot slightly off target. So again, we see this kind of thing where they start with a really small cycle, and they end up with a very large one in the middle of the pitch. And we kind of want to know how are they doing that? In this example, the red wins the ball again and then plays it up the field. So the blue team's trying to break through. And I believe red just won it, plays it over to the left side. And they're about to be offside and the play stops. Okay. So here, we're also interested in what happens when a team is defending. Like, how can you use these channels to defend? So here it looks kind of like when the blue team has the ball out here, it looks very closed off, right? The red team has a lot of dominance, but then this blue player just gets in very slightly and disrupts this whole cycle. So we're interested in knowing how teams can break down those cycles and what it means for the defending team as well. Okay, so like I said, the parts that we're especially interested in this model are the times when the cycle moves up the field. To us, this means that the team has consistent control and stability of the game. And we can be pretty confident that if any player in that cycle gets the ball, they'll have options. And on the other hand, if anyone in the cycle loses the ball, there'll be people pretty close by to be able to make it up. And we also want to know if we can find a pattern in these cycles. So right now, we're looking to see if there's any correlation between the cycles and a goal. There might be, there might not be. We haven't had any definitive results yet. But if we do end up finding that these cycles are dangerous, we want to know if there's a good strategy for the defensive team to stop them, and if there's any good strategy or formations that will help create the cycles. And another interesting point is the defensive team can have their own cycles, and that's something that we've been looking at too in the context of basketball. So even though we aren't done with this model, we found some useful ways to use it already. We can find the average number of passing lanes that a given player is a part of. So for example, here, the red team has been calculated. The goalkeeper is a part of an average of 5.36 cycles, striker 0.76. And that kind of makes sense for their positions. The goalkeeper should be connected to most of their defenders, whereas the striker is kind of moving around trying to get connected and trying to be helpful. We can use this as a measure of a player's effectiveness, but it has to be a little more nuanced than just like if you have a higher number, then you're a better player, because obviously it depends a lot on the positioning of the players as well as the opposing team. If the opposing team is forcing you down the left side continuously, then you might have fewer cycles on that side. Additionally, a team's tactics will impact a player's passing lanes and passing channels. So you might want to make a run to draw away some defenders that will help the player who has the ball, but will actually sacrifice your own passing lane. And we've also noticed that sometimes these Voronoi channels aren't where the ball is. So if we look at the channels that are useful, we want to look at formations and tactics for teams to increase the number of passing lanes that are directly around the ball, because we can assume that those would be more dangerous. We also want to know if there's ways to quantify the importance or the value of these cycles and lanes. So on the left-hand side, we see offensively, this cycle seems to be a lot more helpful. You know, they're pretty close to the net. They can maybe get a cross in there. But then if we look at the defensive side, we would rather have this cycle. So it kind of depends on what's happening in the game. We need to give some kind of value to these cycles. In 3D, perhaps we could look at the volume taken up by them, or the rate of change of that volume, or even just a 2D area. So there's definitely a lot of questions that we're trying to investigate here, and it gives a sense of the possible scope of this model. There's still a lot that we want to investigate with it, but I hope you enjoyed this little introduction. And if you have any questions, you can ask me now, or feel free to email me later. But I'll open up to questions now.
I'll throw another one out. What patterns do you think, I mean, we touched on what you are going to continue to explore with the models and such, but like what kind of patterns do you think you would expect for a successful soccer team versus an unsuccessful soccer team? Like in terms of the cycles and where they show up and stuff.
Yeah. We've found that it's a lot easier to get cycles on the other side of the field than where the ball is, which like makes sense. You know, when where the ball is so heavily defended, the defense isn't really going to let you have much control there. But we expect that a better team would be able to control the area around the ball more, and would also be more disciplined to, if they don't have control, play back to the goalkeeper where there's always a cycle, and kind of maybe switch the point of attack, or not necessarily force it through where they don't have any control. That's one thing that we expect. And then in the 3D model, we're maybe not expecting, but we're hoping to see an increase in the rate of volume of those channels. So can a team very efficiently, increase their Voronoi channel without having too much playback?
And I think I actually have one more add-on to that, which would be, what if you had, so there's a lot of different defensive formations and different specific formations that all soccer teams will go through, and they have different types of attacking styles as well. So how do you think that will play with the formation of cycles? For example, like a counterattack offense versus like a very disciplined moving forward offense. I think they would have very different appearances of cycles over the long periods of time, and you get different shapes. So do you have any idea, or just for supposition?
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting point, and we want to look at it more. We are, I think, just looking for more data at this point. We've recently gotten some more, so we're going to investigate that. But in the past, we've been working with just 2 games, so we didn't really have enough data to make some results about that.
Well, thank you, and good job.
Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you, Emily. That was very interesting. Unless there are other questions, and I think that Emily brought up a good point of the fact that we started with just observations in 2 sets of data, but now we have access to a lot more, and so now we can kind of see if the patterns that we're seeing in the 2 sets of data are occurring more regularly, and how they're impacted by different things like playing style and so on. So very cool. And without further ado, I believe next is Maia. Is that correct? So yeah. Maia Gibbon is also a student at Queen's University.
I'll share my screen. All right, so I'm Maia. Today I'm going to be speaking about offensive rebounds in basketball and kind of observations I've made about what happens when they do occur. So just an outline, we'll talk about the motivation for this project, the importance of offensive rebounds, a calculation that we can use, details of the game we've been looking at, observations of what does happen after an offensive rebound, and then some follow-up questions. So the motivation for this was we wanted to apply what we had been doing with soccer, with geometric modeling, to basketball. So our data came from NBA player tracking, which was only publicly available until 2016. So we're using data from 2016, and then also ESPN to identify certain plays because they have their play-by-plays available. So we have like the X and Y locations of players on the court, game clock, etc. So we chose to model rebounds because they relate a lot to the position of players on the court, which is largely what we've been looking at so far. So the importance of offensive rebounds. First of all, they're significantly less common than defensive rebounds. This is because usually the defensive player stands between the offensive team and the basket to block shots and then to get those rebounds. So it's a lot harder, especially for teams with smaller and slower players. Smaller players is fairly self-explanatory. Obviously, it's harder to get the ball, especially when someone is blocking you. And then slower players may opt not to get it, especially when it's looking like the defensive team will get that ball, because then they will move to the other side of the court and the offensive team will turn defensive and like to keep up. But overall, offensive rebounds create another opportunity for the offensive team to shoot and score again. This can be done in a variety of ways. They may shoot directly off the rebound, pass, or kind of reset the play altogether, which is what we'll be talking about a little later. And overall, they have the ability to help teams significantly because they create another chance for shots. So one of the calculations that is used is the offensive rebounding percentage. This is equal to the number of offensive rebounds divided by the number of offensive rebound chances. So that's offensive rebounds plus the opponent's defensive rebounds. So the game we've been looking at is from January 2016. It was between the Toronto Raptors and the Chicago Bulls. In this game, the Raptors had 12 offensive rebounds with a percentage of about 26%. and 7 of those offensive rebounds led to points. On the other hand, the Bulls had 8 offensive rebounds with a percentage of about 24%. So the numbers of offensive rebounds are pretty different, but the percentages are closer because they're based on the amount of chances. And then of those 8 offensive rebounds, 4 led to points. So we can see that between these two teams in this particular game, about half of the offensive rebounds did lead to points, showing that they are valuable. So what happens after an offensive rebound? There's kind of 3 different things. Either the player who gets the rebound will shoot directly off of that rebound, or they may pass 2 or less passes. Usually that happens pretty quickly and fairly close to where the rebound was, where it was catched. So that's another way to look at it. Or the play may be reset altogether. Usually that happens when there's 3 or more passes, there's a lot of movement. So the diagrams or the pictures we'll be looking at look like this. The red team are the Raptors, the blue team are the Bulls. Green represents the ball. This purple player in each of them will be the player who gets the rebound. And then if there's orange, that is the player who makes the follow-up shot. If there's no orange, that means the purple player made the follow-up shot as well. And the lighter colors represent earlier in the game and darker is later. So we can kind of track the movement of the player over time from a 2D perspective. All right, so the first scenario we kind of observe is when players shoot directly off the rebound. So in this game we're looking at, this happened 7 times and 4 were successful for the Raptors, and then 3 times and 2 were successful for the Bulls. On the left we have maps of all the players. On the right it's just the offensive team. So in this case, the Raptors, and then the purple player was the one who caught the rebound and then proceeded to shoot it again. In these types of scenarios, we don't see very much movement. Usually it's not a lot of time has gone by before that happens. And they're also very common compared to the other types because the players are usually pretty close to the net and in a good position to shoot again. And it's kind of the easiest play that can happen after an offensive rebound. So the second scenario we see is there's 2 or less passes. Again, this happened 5 times. For the Raptors, 3 were successful in getting more points, and then twice for the Bulls with 1 success. And in this case, usually there's a couple passes before a shot is made. Again, not a lot of time passes between the rebound and the follow-up shot, and usually not a ton of movement. We usually see players stay pretty close to or within the 3-point line, unless of course they're trying to make a 3-point shot. But as we can see here, this purple player gets the rebound and then passes it over here before another pass is made, and this orange player shoots it into the basket. So this typically happens when the player who catches the rebound may not be in a good shooting position, but their teammates are. So it requires a little more strategy on their part, but is also fairly common. And the final scenario we see is when there's 3 or more passes and the play resets. Obviously, this is a lot less common. This only happened once and the Raptors were unsuccessful. This is actually what we're looking at. And twice for the Bulls with 1 success. So as we can see, this happens over a greater length of time normally, which accounts for why these look a little more confusing and busy. But the one on the right, we can kind of see around here is where the rebound was caught. It was taken out, passed over here, kind of forms a loop before making it back to this orange player. Sorry, the red and orange look kind of similar here, and then shot once again. So these plays typically have a lot more movement, but are a lot more rare because it's hard to get the ball out from, I guess, under the net, or typically close to where the rebound is caught. But it also gives players more time to move and kind of reset their play entirely if they can do that. So kind of some follow-up and resulting questions that have come from these observations. Are there more detailed patterns within these plays? And kind of how can we predict whether a player will shoot right off? Will they pass? Where will they pass to? Things like that we'd like to continue to look at. And then using that, how much should a team focus on trying to get offensive rebounds? because they've proven to be valuable, but there's also a lot of good teams who don't have good offensive rebound stats just based on the kinds of players they are. So is there a way to implement this so to take advantage of more offensive rebounding chances? Obviously, offensive rebounds are like a second chance. You'd rather get the basket in on the first try, but are there ways that we can prepare in advance for when it doesn't go in and use this model for that? And then the final thing we want to see is, are we able to predict where the rebound will go? This is harder to look at because it depends on how the ball, I guess, bounces off the basket or off the backboard, and then where it goes from there and how far it goes from there. This may depend on how the player threw it, where they threw it from, etc. So another direction we're looking, hopefully, to take this. So with that, that's all I have. I'll open it up to any questions, and thank you for listening.
Okay, so are there any questions?
I will again throw one.
Okay, sounds good.
So we were talking about the kind of, I guess, 3 sets or stages of rebounds. They can either go right back up, they can take a few passes, and hopefully they get a better shot, or 3. Since this was like one game, obviously it's limited data. So let's say you ran it over an entire season and you had the teams in terms of ranked in terms of like best offensive rebounding percentage to worst. Do you think there'd be specific trends would like it would hold up that the best teams just have A, more chances, and B, also will probably get the initial putbacks better than like having to reset the play? Or do you think it might get a little bit more muddled?
I think like the initial one for sure would definitely be the most prominent. In this game alone, half of the offensive rebounds resulted in that kind of play, and in general, it kind of just makes sense. That's the easiest that could happen, but at the same time, I could see it getting a little more muddled. Yeah, obviously this data is kind of limited, but I'd be interested to see it on like a grander scale with more games and other inputs as well.
Thanks, good job.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Yeah, and we can always come back. So great job, Maya, and we can always come back to more questions at the end. So our last speaker today is Sara Stephens, also a student at Queen's University.
Okay, I'll just share my screen and get started. Okay, hi everyone, my name is Sara Stephens, and in this presentation we'll be looking at the implementation of the Voronoi channels model alongside court dominance in a basketball setting. And we'll be eventually sort of working towards a picture that looks somewhat like the one on the bottom right here. So we're going to go through some motivation behind why we created these models, both the Voronoi channels model, similar to what Emily was discussing earlier, transitioning it into a basketball setting, as well viewing it in a less discrete manner with the court dominance model, both in 2D, and then moving both of these models into a 3D setting, so viewing them over time, and combining the two to look at Voronoi channels in the context of court dominance. And lastly, we'll chat about some interesting observations and questions that arose from the examination of these two models. So just a little bit about kind of why I started looking at these two models. So they were largely motivated by the work that both Emily and Dan were doing with geometric soccer modeling. And I really wanted to see if they could be applied to a basketball setting and if one could draw similar conclusions, different conclusions, and compare and contrast despite the smaller court, differences in the game, and less players in a basketball setting. And as Maya was mentioning, the data we're looking at is from SportView NBA player tracking. So the data is only available through the 2016 season, as the NBA stopped publicly publishing it after that. So we are looking at historical data, and I chose to look at the same game that Maya did. So the Raptors versus the Bulls in 2016. There's no particular reason as to why we chose this game, in case you're wondering. And so as Maya was mentioning, we matched it up with ESPN play-by-play data to identify useful frames. So there are 25 frames a second in the data set. And we really wanted to see what frames would be more useful to look at and would correspond to certain plays, such as rebounders, 3 points, jump shots, etc. And from there, we took this data and created 2 base models. So the Voronoi channel passing model, similar to what Emily was describing earlier, as well as the court dominance model that was inspired by Toronto FC analyst Devin and his soccer analytic notebooks. So first taking a look at the Voronoi channels model. So this is going to be quite similar to what Emily was describing earlier. So we use a Voronoi tessellation to split up the field in a very discrete manner. So here we have the Bulls represented in blue and the Raptors represented in red. So you can see there's 5 Bulls players and 5 Raptors players, as well as the ball represented by the white circle down here. So essentially every player's Voronoi region is the area which they can arrive at faster than any other player on the court, similar to what Dan was describing. And so we look at all types of passes that are made during a certain time frame and use the idea of a passing lane, similar to soccer. So it's going to be a line between 2 players that don't cross into another team's Voronoi region. So for example, these 2 players have a passing lane, but this player and this player would not be able to have a passing lane because it would cross into this Bulls player's dominant region here. So green lines are passing lanes and the red represents a passing cycle. So a sequence of passes that can be made in a row. And there are often, as Emily was mentioning, a lot of cycles that don't include the player on the ball. And I was particularly interested in looking at, so in this scenario, the Bulls, we'll view it in 3D in a second, are the offensive team. And they go for a jump shot, miss it, and the Raptors get the rebound. So I was particularly interested in looking at the passing cycles over time in both the offensive and the defensive teams, and comparing them and seeing what we can learn from a team who maybe doesn't have the ball, but is still seeking to create passing cycles, and what does that say about offensive and defensive strategies. So moving into a 3D setting. So similar to what Dan and Emily had in their models, I like to think of this as we're looking at a book over time. And if you flip the book sideways, you see a stack of pages where every page is the court at a certain time. So you'll start at time 0 and all the way up. You'll get, as the court goes on, you'll see the 3D polygons kind of stack upon each other. So we've turned all the cycles into polygons. So here you can kind of see we have a couple little polygons that were created at the start. And so all of our models today are going to look at one specific play just for some continuity in our diagrams. So the specific play, as I was mentioning, was a missed jump shot by the Bulls, the blue team, on this basket over here, and the Raptors, the red team, successfully defended the shot and were able to get the rebound. So in this particular model, the top team is the home team, so the Raptors, in this case, the defensive team, and the bottom team is the Bulls, so the offensive team in blue. So here you'll only see the Raptors passing cycles and lanes, so it will be the red. And down here, you'll only see the Bulls passing cycles and lanes, so it will be in the blue here. So if we play that, we get, we'll chat about it after. Awesome. Maybe I'll just play it one more time because I feel like it takes a bit to get used to the first time you look at these types of models. So one more time. So that's the offensive team on the top and the defensive team, or sorry, the offensive team on the bottom and the defensive team on the top. And you can see the shot was missed, and that's most likely, we can look at it. There's quite a lack of passing lanes on behalf of the offensive team, and the defensive team was actually able to create passing lanes. And we want to look at what does that have to do with preventing the shot on behalf of the offensive team. So even though the team up here doesn't actually have the ball, they are using passing lanes effectively to potentially aid in defense, which was interesting to me, and also probably contributed into them getting the rebounds. And so another interesting thing to note is if you play the model fully through, the 2 3D shapes kind of created by up here the defensive and down here the offensive seem to correspond. So we took that and transitioned into a court dominance model. So what I was particularly interested in seeing with this model is if the previous model could be interpreted in a less discrete manner. So for example, I thought it was not always the case that a team either has a region or doesn't have a region. I think it maybe is more accurate to say that some teams hold regions more strongly and other regions less so, and some regions are more equalized. So that's how we came up with this court dominance model. So basically, essentially how it works is that we build an empty matrix for each team and kind of determine the spatial bounds that each cell within our matrix does represent. And if a player is in the cell, we set it equal to 1 and subtract the home surface, so the red surface here from the blue surface here. Use a Gaussian blur to smooth the values and apply a contour plot on top, which results in what you see here in the background. So we have the Raptors areas of dominance in the red. So the darker red represents more dominance, and the Bulls area in blue. So the darker blue represents more blue dominance, and the areas that are more equalized between the two are kind of these outer regions out here. And I also chose to make the ball larger and in green down here so that it was easier to track over time in the course of this model. So this is the same model in 3D. So you'll see the dominance region shifting on the right-hand side, and the left hand will be it displaying over time. So this is no passing channels, just going through the areas of dominance. So that's just looking at the areas of dominance. It's particularly interesting to note, kind of as the shot is being made in this region here, how much dominance the Raptors actually do have near the basket, and sort of resulting in, as you see right here, getting the rebound on behalf of the Raptors. So we took this model and overlaid it with the Voronoi channels model. So these channels were created exactly, oops. Oh my gosh, okay. There we go. So this model the channels were created exactly in the same way as the very first channels that we saw. And this is overlaid onto the dominance model. And so this particular model that I'm gonna show in 3D in a second only shows Voronoi channels for the offensive team, the blue, because I did found it easier to look at, only looking sort of at one team at a time. So we just have the Bulls Voronoi passing channels overlaid onto the court dominance of both teams. And so I found it particularly interesting to note that the passing channels often fall in areas of dominance of the team, but that's not always the case. And so, for example, you'll see in the animation in a second that sometimes the passing lanes will fall across the red area of dominance. So something like that. And I thought it would be really interesting to look at that and say, what does that say about the strength of the pass overall, or perhaps even looking at the accuracy of the Voronoi passing channel, given the context of a more or less discrete dominance. So over time, you'll see the court dominance model exactly the same as we saw a couple slides ago, build up over time. And then you'll also see the passing lanes of the offensive team, the Bulls, over time on 2D on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, you'll see that same sort of 3D polygon structure start to build with the dark blue polygons there. So overall, I think it's really interesting to notice how the defending team does a really great job, like I was saying before, of minimizing offensive passing lanes. So particularly near where the basket is being stored, you see very, very few passing lanes created by the offensive team in blue and the Bulls, which likely has something to do with them getting the rebound and displaying more dominance. So it's particularly interesting to note that, for example, if we look at something like this, you see that the passing channels are not always in the blue team's area of dominance. So this is an area of higher red dominance, for example. So you wonder kind of what does that say about the strength of the pass overall if it's not going through the area of blue dominance. So some interesting kind of observations and questions that I think this model could be useful for. It would be really interesting to examine passing patterns in these cycles over time, over the course of a game, the course of the season, or compare between teams or within the league itself, and kind of what do these passing channels say about the chance of making a basket or getting a rebound, or potentially expanding further the chance of winning a game. And it's interesting to note the comparison between the two models. So the bottom left here, we have the Voronoi diagram and the passing channels, and the bottom right here, we have the court dominance and the passing channels. So which model more accurately predicts where the available passing lanes are? Because as we noted, passing lanes are always in Voronoi regions, but not necessarily in regions of dominance. And so which diagram is better indicative of the regions that the team has control over? And what does this say about kind of how much focus a team should focus on preventing passing lanes as an offense and a defense, or creating their own, and kind of the value of passing lanes for both the offense and the defense? So some additional questions are, we could definitely do some specific player analysis to gain further insight. And so we can look at, are specific players connected to more passing lanes, similar to what Emily was showing with the numbers on her model. And so what does this say about player strength? And so what I was saying before, the importance of passing cycles for both the offensive and the defensive teams. So you can see here the passing cycles for the defensive on the left and the offensive on the right, and kind of what do these say about the importance of passing cycles for each team respectively, and potentially looking at creating a metric that quantifies the value of passing lanes for the offensive and the defensive teams, and looking at doing geometric analysis on these polygon shapes created over time. Lastly, something I'd like to do is incorporate player velocity into this model, since it doesn't incorporate that, and I feel like that would be a really good next step to getting the models to be more accurate. So thank you so much for listening, and if anyone has any questions, you can ask them now, or please feel free to email me.
Okay, so wonderful, Sarah. Are there any more questions?
I'll jump in with my one.
Okay, excellent.
And so the way that this model started was kind of trying to take it from a soccer context and move it to a basketball context, at least for the Voronoi channels one. So how do you think they will contrast when you're able to run it over multiple iterations for things, like the differences between the two?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at, maybe I'll go back to a picture here to explain it better, court dominance versus Voronoi diagrams. So I think Emily and I were discussing the importance of having sort of a less discrete representation of both the areas of dominance for both the home team and the away team. And I really feel like basketball is better displayed by something a little bit less discrete than soccer. And I think we can definitely notice that. I think perhaps soccer is more applicable to a Voronoi tessellation model, whereas something less discrete, it might be more applicable in a basketball setting. And I would really like to look at these trends as they continue over time, and potentially getting more data and doing some more sort of matching it to the play-by-play to look at these trends over the context, like I was mentioning, of a game or of a season as well.
Well, thank you and good job.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So I can clap now. Is that all of our questions, or is there anything more? Okay, so thank you again for wonderful talks, everybody.